The quantum transponder hummed with an electric tension that seemed to defy the cold silence of deep space. Captain Jessica Miller watched the holographic display, her fingers drumming an irregular rhythm against the reinforced command chair of the Starship Horizon. Around her, the bridge crew moved with a synchronicity that bordered on the supernatural, each member an extension of a collective consciousness that defied traditional military hierarchy. Lieutenant Marcus Rodriguez, the ship's primary systems analyst, caught her eye and raised an eyebrow. "Confederacy sensors are going absolutely nuts," he said, his voice a mix of amusement and professional curiosity. The holographic display flickered, revealing a complex web of scanning beams that probed and prodded at the horizon like nervous tentacles. The ship itself was a marvel of human ingenuity and complete disregard for conventional spacecraft design. Where alien vessels were sleek, symmetrical, and purpose-built, the Horizon looked like something assembled from a combination of cutting-edge technology and salvage yard creativity. Mismatched hull plating bore scorch marks from previous encounters, each one a story of survival that would make most alien species weep. "They're trying to categorize us," Captain Miller muttered, more to herself than to anyone else. Her neural interface, a delicate web of quantum-entangled circuitry that ran just beneath her skin, picked up the subtle vibrations of the ship's computational core. Most alien species would consider such direct neural integration somewhere between madness and suicide. Humans saw it as just another Tuesday. Dr. Elena Yamamoto, the ship's lead xenobiologist, approached the central display. Her augmented eyes, a patchwork of biological and synthetic components, scrolled through incoming data streams faster than most computers could process. "They've never seen anything like us before," she said, a hint of playful malevolence in her voice. "We're about to become the most interesting thing in their galactic database." The Horizon's computational core, which the crew had affectionately nicknamed Wild Card, was already running millions of potential scenario calculations. It wasn't just a navigational computer or a strategic analysis tool. It was a living, evolving intelligence that viewed the universe as an intricate puzzle waiting to be solved. Outside the ship's reinforced viewports, the stark emptiness of space was interrupted by the massive sensor arrays of the Galactic Confederacy. Hundreds of monitoring stations, each the size of a small moon, watched with a combination of technological precision and growing uncertainty. Their sensors were designed to catalog, classify, and contain. They were about to meet something that defied categorization. "Incoming communication request," Lieutenant Rodriguez announced. His fingers danced across a holographic interface that seemed to shimmer and change with each touch. "They're using standard Confederacy protocols. But something feels off." Captain Miller leaned forward, a predatory smile playing across her lips. Humanity had spent centuries being underestimated, first on their home planet, then in their initial steps into space. Every encounter was an opportunity to rewrite the rules, to show that being human meant something far more complex than any standardized galactic classification could capture. "Let's give them a welcome they'll never forget," she said. The ship's communication systems came alive. But instead of a standard diplomatic greeting, what emerged was a carefully constructed transmission that was part mathematical equation, part musical composition, and part pure, unadulterated chaos. It wasn't a message so much as a statement of intent, a declaration that humanity had arrived, and the universe was about to get very interesting. Dr. Yamamoto chuckled, her augmented eyes reflecting data streams that seemed to dance and pulse with living energy. "They're going to need a bigger database," she muttered. Lieutenant Rodriguez's console erupted in a cascade of warning signals. Sensor readings spiked. Computer systems across the monitoring stations began to fluctuate, and for a brief moment, the entire fabric of Confederacy communication networks seemed to hiccup. The Horizon wasn't just entering their space. It was rewriting the very rules of engagement. Captain Jessica Miller settled back into her command chair, watching the growing confusion spread across the Confederacy's monitoring systems. First contact was about to become something entirely new. and humanity was just getting started. The first volley of weapons fire came precisely 17 minutes and 42 seconds after initial contact. The Zorn battle cruisers, massive crystalline structures that looked like weaponized geodes, unleashed a barrage that would have obliterated any known spacecraft in the Galactic Confederacy. The Horizon didn't just survive. It danced. Incoming. Lieutenant Marcus Rodriguez called out, his voice more excited than alarmed. His hands moved in a blur across the holographic interface, fingers weaving complex patterns that seemed to anticipate the weapon trajectories before they fully materialized. On the bridge, Captain Jessica Miller watched with a predatory grin. Her neural interface hummed, synchronizing with the ship's computational core in a way that would have driven most alien species mad. To her, it was as natural as breathing. Dr. Elena Yamamoto leaned over the tactical display, her augmented eyes processing information at speeds that made standard computer systems look like children's toys. "They're using a standard dispersal pattern," she muttered. "Textbook approach, literally textbook." The first Zorn energy blast should have torn through the Horizon's hull. Instead, the ship seemed to ripple, not through traditional shield technology, but through something far more complex. The energy wave passed through what appeared to be empty space, only to find itself redirected, its destructive potential transformed into something else entirely. "Redirecting particle stream," Rodriguez announced, his fingers dancing across the interface, converting kinetic energy to. He paused, grinning. Guitar riff. The ship's communication systems erupted with sound. What should have been a devastating weapon impact transformed into an elaborate musical composition. Complex harmonic structures danced across the Zorn communication bands, a middle finger to conventional warfare wrapped in pure, unadulterated creativity. "They're going to love this," Captain Miller mumbled. The computational core, their beloved wild card, was having the time of its existence. Where other ships' AIs would be calculating defensive protocols, this system was turning the entire conflict into an elaborate game. Weapon trajectories became scoring opportunities. Defensive maneuvers looked like an intricate dance, with the Horizon literally weaving between energy blasts as if gravity was more of a suggestion than a law. Dr. Yamamoto's augmented display began to overlay the weapon impacts with real-time artistic interpretations. Each Zorn energy blast was transformed into a complex visual representation, part mathematical equation, part abstract art, part pure chaos theory in motion. "Incoming transmission," Rodriguez called out. His fingers hovered over the communication interface, a mischievous glint in his eye. The Zorn communication burst was a standard threat display, a combination of mathematical precision and linguistic aggression that had cowed countless species before humanity. Captain Miller's response was something else entirely. A single transmission burst, 5 words that would be discussed in diplomatic circles for generations. "You mad, bro?" The computational complexity of the transmission defied explanation. It wasn't just a message. It was a mathematical proof, a musical composition, and a psychological warfare technique all wrapped into a single burst of information. Alien communication analysts would spend years trying to fully decode its implications. On the bridge, Dr. Yamamoto couldn't help but laugh. "They're going to need a bigger database," she muttered, echoing her earlier comment. The Zorn battle cruisers continued their assault, each weapon impact becoming something more than a traditional attack. The Horizon wasn't just defending itself, it was transforming the very nature of conflict. Lieutenant Rodriguez's console displayed a real-time scoring system that seemed to be tracking the encounter like an elaborate video game. Weapon impacts became point values. Defensive maneuvers earned style points. The entire conflict was becoming performance art. "Redirecting energy cascade," Rodriguez announced, "converting destruction into, you know what? I'm going to make this a dubstep track." The ship's communication systems erupted in a complex musical composition that was part mathematical theorem, part electronic dance music. Weapon impacts became bass drops. Defensive maneuvers transformed into elaborate rhythmic structures. Captain Miller settled back into her command chair, watching the growing confusion spread across the Zorn battle network. First Contact was rapidly becoming something entirely new, and humanity was just getting started. The universe would never be the same again. The Zorn quickly discovered that human warfare was less about destroying an enemy and more about systematically dismantling their will to fight. What began as a military engagement had transformed into something entirely unprecedented, a multi-dimensional psychological performance that defied every known rule of galactic conflict. Deep within the Zorn command structure, panic began to spread like a quantum virus. Commander Zarakul, the most decorated strategic analyst in the Zorn military, stared at the communication reports with mounting confusion. What should have been standard tactical updates had become something else entirely. Intercepted human communications were less military transmissions and more something else. Fragments of complex mathematical equations, snippets of music, elaborate jokes that seemed to contain hidden layers of meaning. "It doesn't make sense," she muttered, her crystalline exoskeleton shifting with agitation. The human approach to conflict was so fundamentally alien that it broke standard analytical models. Small human teams began appearing in the most impossible locations. They didn't just hack Zorn communication networks, they'd redesigned them. Entire military command structures found their systems replaced with elaborate puzzle games, intricate music compositions, and streams of consciousness that seemed to be part technical manual, part surrealist poetry. One Zorn communication hub discovered its entire defensive framework had been replaced with an interactive game that combined advanced quantum mechanics with what appeared to be a centuries-old Earth children's game called Minecraft. Military access codes became riddle challenges. Secure communication channels transformed into collaborative art projects. Lieutenant Marcus Rodriguez managed the infiltration with a level of enthusiasm that bordered on manic creativity. "Watch this," he told Dr. Elena Yamamoto, his fingers dancing across the holographic interface. "I'm going to make their entire early warning system play, never gonna give you up every third communication burst." The ship's computational core, their beloved wild card, was operating at levels of complexity that made traditional artificial intelligence look like pocket calculators. It wasn't just breaking into Zorn systems. It was rewriting the fundamental language of their technological infrastructure. Captain Jessica Miller watched the developing situation with a predatory smile. Humanity had spent centuries being underestimated, first on their home planet, and then in their initial steps into space. Every encounter was an opportunity to demonstrate that being human meant something far more complex than any standardized galactic classification could capture. In one particularly elaborate infiltration, a human team managed to redirect an entire Zorn fleet's navigation systems. Instead of their intended military deployment, the ships found themselves performing an intricate space ballet, their movement patterns creating a massive, kilometers-wide image visible from multiple star systems. The image was a perfect recreation of a classic internet meme, a cat wearing sunglasses. Dr. Yamamoto's augmented eyes tracked the infiltration in real time, her biological and synthetic components working in perfect harmony. "They're not just attacking," she observed. "They're telling a story." And what a story it was. Zorn communication analysts began to develop what could only be described as an existential crisis. Their most secure systems were being transformed into collaborative art installations. Military databases became interactive experiences that challenged fundamental assumptions about warfare, communication, and reality itself. One particularly memorable infiltration involved replacing critical military communication protocols with an elaborate choose-your-own-adventure narrative. Commander Zarakul found herself navigating a complex story that seemed to change based on her emotional responses, with plot branches that referenced obscure human cultural moments and philosophical concepts. "It's psychological warfare," one Zorn analyst reported, "but not as we understand it." The human approach defied categorization. They weren't just fighting a war. They were conducting the most elaborate, high-stakes improvisation performance in galactic history. Every system infiltration was a punchline. Every communication breach was a work of art. Lieutenant Rodriguez couldn't help but laugh as another Zorn communication network transformed into an interactive musical about the futility of traditional military thinking. "We're not just fighting," he told Captain Miller. "We're teaching them a lesson." And somewhere in the vast emptiness of space, the horizon continued its dance. Part worship, part performance art piece, entirely, unequivocally human. The universe was about to get very interesting. The Galactic Observation Network watched in a collective state of bewilderment. What should have been a straightforward military conflict had transformed into something entirely unprecedented, a performance that defied every known principle of interstellar engagement. Professor Krintok, the most respected xenostrategist in the Galactic Confederacy, stared at the accumulated data with a mixture of horror and fascination. The human approach to conflict was less a military strategy and more a complex, living art form that seemed to rewrite the fundamental rules of interaction with each passing moment. Alien military experts found themselves watching hours of intercepted human communications, their analytical systems struggling to process what they were seeing. It wasn't just data. It was a narrative, a living, breathing entity that changed with each observation. The horizon continued its impossible dance through contested space, leaving a trail of computational chaos in its wake. Lieutenant Marcus Rodriguez was in his element. His fingers danced across holographic interfaces that seemed to breathe and pulse with living information. "Watch this," he told Dr. Elena Yamamoto, a mischievous glint in his eye. "I'm going to make their entire early warning system solve a Rubik's Cube." Supply lines didn't just get disrupted, they got reimagined. Communication networks didn't crash. They evolved into living, breathing entities of pure information chaos. Where other species saw military infrastructure, humans saw an opportunity for the most elaborate practical joke in galactic history. A captured human operative, when brought before the Zorn High Command for interrogation, spent 4 hours explaining the strategic implications of a knock-knock joke. By the end of the session, 3 senior Zorn military leaders had requested transfers. One had taken up abstract painting, and another had begun writing what appeared to be a deeply philosophical memoir about the nature of humor. Captain Jessica Miller watched the unfolding scenario with a predatory satisfaction. Humanity had spent centuries being underestimated, first on their home planet, and then in their initial steps into space. Every encounter was an opportunity to demonstrate that being human meant something far more complex than any standardized galactic classification could capture. The ship's computational core, their beloved willed card, was operating at levels of complexity that made traditional artificial intelligence look like simple pocket calculators. It wasn't just processing information, it was creating entire narrative structures that existed somewhere between mathematics, art, and pure chaos theory. In one particularly memorable infiltration, human operatives managed to redirect an entire Zorn fleet's navigation systems. Instead of their intended military deployment, the ships found themselves performing an intricate space ballet. Their movement patterns created a massive, kilometers-wide image visible from multiple star systems, a perfect recreation of a classic internet meme featuring a cat wearing sunglasses and giving a thumbs up. Dr. Yamamoto's augmented eyes tracked the infiltration in real time, her biological and synthetic components working in perfect harmony. "They're not just attacking," she observed to Captain Miller. "They're telling a story and making a point." Zorn communication analysts began to develop what could only be described as an existential crisis. Their most secure systems were being transformed into collaborative art installations. Military databases became interactive experiences that challenged fundamental assumptions about warfare, communication, and reality itself. One particularly elaborate infiltration involved replacing critical military communication protocols with an advanced version of an ancient Earth game called Dungeons and Dragons. Senior military commanders found themselves navigating complex narrative scenarios that required cooperation, creativity, and a fundamental reimagining of their hierarchical structures. It's psychological warfare, one bewildered Zorn analyst reported. But not as we understand it. The computational complexity of human interactions defied traditional understanding. They weren't just fighting a war. They were conducting the most elaborate, high-stakes improvisation performance in galactic history. Every system infiltration was a punchline. Every communication breach was a work of art. Lieutenant Rodriguez couldn't help but laugh as another Zorn communication network transformed into an interactive musical about the futility of traditional military thinking. "We're not just fighting," he told Captain Miller. "We're giving them a masterclass in creativity." Across the galaxy, species watched in a mixture of terror and fascination. The humans weren't just challenging military doctrine, they were rewriting the fundamental rules of interaction. Every moment was an opportunity for creativity, every conflict a chance to tell a story that had never been told before. And somewhere in the vast emptiness of space, the horizon continued its impossible dance. Part worship, part performance art piece, entirely, unequivocally human. The universe would never be the same again. The psychological disintegration of the Zorn military leadership happened gradually, and then all at once. Commander Zarakul sat in her primary observation chamber, her crystalline exoskeleton trembling with a combination of fear and unprecedented confusion. The human approach to conflict had become something far beyond traditional warfare. It was a living, breathing entity that seemed to feed on the very foundations of Zorn military doctrine. Her communication analysts had stopped providing traditional reports weeks ago. Instead, they submitted increasingly bizarre documents that read like a combination of abstract poetry, advanced mathematical proofs, and what appeared to be elaborate stand-up comedy routines. "They're not just attacking our systems," Dr. Revik, her chief strategic analyst, mumbled during their last briefing. His eyes were wild, unfocused. "They're attacking our entire concept of reality." The human operatives didn't just infiltrate Zorn systems, they reimagined them. Entire fleet formations would receive communication bursts that were part strategic update, part philosophical inquiry, and part interactive puzzle. Military commanders found themselves solving increasingly complex challenges just to access basic operational information. What should have been a straightforward military communication became an elaborate game that challenged every fundamental assumption about hierarchy, strategy, and communication. Lieutenant Marcus Rodriguez managed these infiltrations with a level of enthusiasm that bordered on performance art. "Watch this," he told Dr. Elena Yamamoto, his fingers dancing across holographic interfaces that seemed to breathe and pulse with living information. "I'm going to make their entire early warning system solve an existential philosophy problem before it can report any threat." The ship's computational core, their beloved wild card, operated at levels of complexity that made traditional artificial intelligence look like children's toys. It didn't just process information, it created entire narrative structures that existed somewhere between mathematics, art, and pure chaos theory. Captain Jessica Miller watched the unfolding psychological dismantling with a predatory satisfaction. Humanity had spent centuries being underestimated, first on their home planet, and then in their initial steps into space. Every encounter was an opportunity to demonstrate that being human meant something far more complex than any standardized galactic classification could capture. One particularly memorable infiltration involved replacing critical military communication protocols with an interactive experience that combined elements of psychoanalysis, abstract art, and an ancient Earth children's game called Twister. Senior Zorn military commanders found themselves navigating complex psychological challenges that required them to physically contort themselves while answering increasingly bizarre philosophical questions. Dr. Elena Yamamoto's augmented eyes tracked the infiltration in real time, her biological and synthetic components working in perfect harmony. "They're not just breaking their systems," she observed. "They're deconstructing their entire psychological framework." The Zorn began to see human operatives everywhere. Shadows in communication corridors seemed to shift with impossible complexity. Communication channels would suddenly burst into elaborate musical compositions that contained hidden layers of strategic information. Military databases transformed into living, breathing entities that seemed to mock the very concept of secure information. It's psychological warfare, one increasingly paranoid Zorn analyst reported, but not as we understand it. Lieutenant Rodriguez couldn't help but laugh as another Zorn communication network transformed into an interactive experience that was part therapy session, part complex mathematical proof, and part surrealist performance art. "We're not just fighting," he told Captain Miller. "We're giving them a masterclass in human creativity." Commander Zarakul found herself spending hours trying to decode a single communication burst that seemed to contain an entire universe of meaning. What began as a simple military transmission had become a complex narrative that challenged everything she understood about communication, strategy, and the nature of conflict itself. The computational complexity of human interactions defied traditional understanding. They weren't just fighting a war. They were conducting the most elaborate, high-stakes improvisation performance in galactic history. Every system infiltration was a punchline. Every communication breach was a work of art. Across the Zorn military structure, something fundamental was breaking down. Traditional hierarchies crumbled. Strategic models collapsed. The very concept of military engagement was being reimagined in real time, with humans serving as both the architects and the performance artists of this new reality. And somewhere in the vast emptiness of space, the horizon continued its impossible dance, part worship, part psychological experiment, part living artwork, entirely, unequivocally human. The universe would never be the same again. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source, a captured human operative who seemed more amused than concerned about her captivity. Her name was Emma Rice, a specialist in what the humans casually referred to as comprehensive strategic engagement. The Zorn interrogation chamber was a marvel of technological sophistication, a space designed to break down the psychological defenses of any known species in the galaxy. Intricate mural scanning devices lined the walls. Quantum resonance fields could theoretically extract information from the deepest recesses of any sentient mind. Emma Reyes smiled. "You're asking the wrong questions," she told the assembled Zorn intelligence team. Her hands were unbound, her posture relaxed, a detail that should have immediately set off alarm bells for any competent interrogator. Dr. Krinvox, the lead interrogation specialist, leaned forward. His crystalline exoskeleton shifted with anticipation. "Explain," he demanded. What followed was less an interrogation and more a masterclass in human perception. Emma began to outline how humanity had studied every known galactic conflict, every military doctrine, every communication protocol. But they hadn't just studied to understand. They had studied to reimagine. "Conflict isn't about destruction," she explained, drawing complex diagrams that seemed to shift and change with each explanation. "It's about communication. It's about storytelling." The diagrams she created defied traditional understanding. Mathematical equations danced with artistic representations. Strategic models transformed into living, breathing narratives that seemed to pulse with an impossible complexity. Lieutenant Marcus Rodriguez, watching remotely from the horizon, couldn't help but grin. "She's doing it," he told Dr. Elena Yamamoto. "She's giving them the full human treatment." Captain Jessica Miller watched the transmission with a predatory satisfaction. Humanity had spent centuries being underestimated, first on their home planet, and then in their initial steps into space. Every encounter was an opportunity to demonstrate that being human meant something far more complex than any standardized galactic classification could capture. Emma's explanation became a performance, part academic lecture, part avant-garde art installation, part philosophical treatise. She demonstrated how human strategy treated conflict as a collaborative art form. Where other species saw warfare as a zero-sum game, humans saw it as an elaborate conversation. The Zorn analysts found themselves drawn into her narrative. Traditional interrogation protocols dissolved. The very concept of information extraction transformed into something else entirely. "We don't just fight," Emma explained, her hands creating intricate holographic projections that seemed to breathe and pulse with living information. "We communicate. We tell stories. Every conflict is a narrative waiting to be explored." The ship's computational core, their beloved willed card, analyzed the transmission in real time. It wasn't just processing information, it was creating entire universes of potential meaning, breaking down the transmission into layers upon layers of complexity. Dr. Krinvox realized something fundamental was happening. This wasn't just an interrogation. This was a complete reimagining of conflict itself. Emma began to explain the human approach to strategic engagement. It wasn't about winning or losing. It was about creating a shared experience, about transforming conflict into a form of collective storytelling that challenged every fundamental assumption about communication, strategy, and interaction. "Your military protocols," she said, "are just badly written stories." The Zorn analysts found themselves simultaneously terrified and fascinated. Here was a species that didn't just challenge their understanding of conflict. They were rewriting the entire concept of interaction. Lieutenant Rodriguez watched the transmission with growing excitement. "She's giving them the full download," he told Captain Miller. "They're not going to know what hit them." As the interrogation continued, the very structure of the Zorn intelligence facility began to change. Walls seemed to become more permeable. Communication channels twisted into impossible geometries. The very concept of secure information dissolved. Emma Reyes continued her explanation, her words creating entire universes of possibility. She wasn't just explaining human strategy. She was performing it. And somewhere in the vast emptiness of space, the horizon continued its impossible dance. Part worship, part living artwork, part ongoing conversation with the universe. The Zorn were about to learn that humanity was something entirely different. The diplomatic resolution began in a manner that defied every known protocol of galactic conflict resolution. Captain Jessica Miller stood across from the Zorn High Council, her crew behind her, looking more like a group of artists preparing for a performance than a military delegation. The negotiation chamber, a massive crystalline structure that had witnessed countless interstellar treaties, seemed to pulse with an uncertain energy. "We're not here to conquer," she began, her words accompanied by a holographic display that was part technical presentation, part abstract art installation. "We're here to communicate." Lieutenant Marcus Rodriguez managed the communication interface, his fingers dancing across holographic projections that seemed to breathe and shift with living information. Dr. Elena Yamamoto stood nearby, her augmented eyes tracking every minute detail of the alien responses. The Zorn High Council watched in a state of collective bewilderment. What should have been a standard negotiation had transformed into something entirely unprecedented. Emma Reyes, the operative who had so dramatically revealed the human approach to conflict, stood as a key advisor. Her earlier interrogation had been more of a performance than a traditional information extraction. Now, she was about to demonstrate the full complexity of human diplomatic engagement. The terms proposed by the humans were nothing short of miraculous. Instead of demanding reparations or territorial concessions, they suggested a collaborative framework that was part cultural exchange, part scientific research project, and part ongoing artistic collaboration. "Conflict is just a conversation we haven't finished yet," Captain Miller explained, her words accompanied by holographic representations that seemed to dance and pulse with living complexity. The Zorn found themselves navigating a negotiation that was less about traditional diplomacy and more about creating a shared narrative. Each proposed term came with layers of meaning, mathematical equations that were also poetry, strategic proposals that read like elaborate jokes, communication protocols that were themselves works of art. Lieutenant Rodriguez couldn't help but grin. "Watch this," he whispered to Dr. Yamamoto. "I'm going to make our entire diplomatic proposal solve a complex philosophical problem while explaining quantum entanglement. The ship's computational core, their beloved willed card, was operating at levels of complexity that made traditional artificial intelligence look like simple pocket calculators. It didn't just process information, it created entire universes of potential meaning, breaking down each diplomatic proposal into layers upon layers of complexity. One particularly memorable proposal involved a collaborative research project that combined elements of theoretical physics, performance art, and an ancient Earth game called Twister. The Zorn High Council found themselves physically and intellectually contorting themselves to understand the full implications of the human approach. Dr. Elena Yamamoto tracked the negotiation in real time, her biological and synthetic components working in perfect harmony. "They're not just negotiating," she observed. "They're creating a new form of interspecies communication." The diplomatic terms defied traditional understanding. Where other species saw negotiation as a zero-sum game, humans saw it as an elaborate collaborative art form. Each proposed resolution was a story waiting to be told, a conversation waiting to unfold. Emma Reyes moved between the human delegation and the Zorn High Council, translating not just words, but entire conceptual frameworks. She wasn't just an interpreter. She was a performance artist, a diplomat, a storyteller. "We're not asking for territory," Captain Miller explained. "We're proposing a shared exploration of possibility." The Zorn found themselves agreeing to terms they didn't fully understand, but which somehow satisfied all parties involved. It was less a treaty and more a collaborative artistic manifesto, a declaration of mutual exploration and understanding. Lieutenant Rodriguez watched the unfolding negotiation with growing excitement. "We're not just making peace," he told Captain Miller. "We're creating an entirely new way of interacting with the universe." As the negotiations continued, the very structure of the diplomatic chamber began to change. Walls seemed to become more permeable. Communication channels twisted into impossible geometries. The very concept of traditional diplomacy dissolved. And somewhere in the vast emptiness of space, the horizon continued its impossible dance. Part worship, part living artwork, part ongoing conversation with the universe. The Zorn were about to learn that humanity was something entirely different. Diplomacy would never be the same again. The aftermath of the human-Zorn encounter rippled through galactic civilization like a quantum shockwave. In diplomatic circles, research institutions, and military academies across countless star systems, the encounter became the stuff of legend. It wasn't just a conflict or a diplomatic resolution. It was a fundamental reimagining of how intelligent species could interact. Professor Krintok, the most respected xenostrategist in the Galactic Confederacy, spent years analyzing the encounter. His comprehensive report, a massive multi-volume work that became required reading across dozens of civilizations, concluded that humanity represented something entirely unprecedented in galactic history. "They are not a species," his final chapter read. "They are a living, breathing approach to existence." Captain Jessica Miller and her crew of the Horizon had become more than just military personnel. They were performance artists. They were philosophers. They were living proof that conflict could be transformed into communication, that warfare could be a form of storytelling. Lieutenant Marcus Rodriguez continued to develop the computational frameworks that had so thoroughly dismantled the Zorn military structure. What began as a strategic tool had become something else entirely, a living, breathing approach to understanding complexity that defied traditional computational models. Dr. Elena Yamamoto's research into human-alien interaction became a new field of study. Her groundbreaking work explored how humanity's unique approach to communication could bridge seemingly insurmountable differences between species. The Zorn, far from being destroyed, found themselves fundamentally transformed. Their military structure collapsed, only to be rebuilt into something more fluid, more adaptive. They had learned that rigidity was the true enemy of survival. Emma Reyes, the operative who had so dramatically revealed the human approach to conflict, became a legendary figure. Her lectures, part academic presentation, part performance art, were studied across multiple civilizations. She wasn't just explaining a method of interaction. She was demonstrating an entire philosophy of existence. The ship's computational core, their beloved willed card, became the foundation of a new approach to artificial intelligence. It wasn't just a tool. It was a living, collaborative intelligence that viewed complexity as an opportunity for creation. Across the galaxy, species began to reconsider fundamental assumptions about communication, conflict, and cooperation. The human approach wasn't just a military strategy. It was a way of understanding the universe itself. Military academies found their traditional training protocols rendered obsolete. Diplomatic institutions were forced to completely reimagine their approach to interspecies communication. What had once been seen as fixed rules became fluid possibilities. Lieutenant Rodriguez loved to joke that they hadn't just won a conflict. They had started a revolution of understanding. The technological innovations that emerged from the encounter were breathtaking. Communication systems that could translate not just words, but entire conceptual frameworks. Computational models that treated information as a living, breathing entity. Strategic approaches that saw conflict as a form of collaborative storytelling. Captain Miller watched the unfolding legacy with a sense of quiet satisfaction. Humanity had always been about pushing boundaries, about seeing possibilities where others saw limitations. The horizon became more than just a ship. It was a symbol of a new approach to existence. Part warship, part research vessel, part living artwork, it continued to dance through the stars. A living demonstration of humanity's infinite potential. Other species began to study human history, human culture, human approaches to problem solving. They discovered a species that had survived against impossible odds, that had transformed every challenge into an opportunity for creativity and growth. Dr. Yamamoto's research revealed something profound. Humanity's greatest strength wasn't its technology. It was its ability to reimagine, to transform, to see potential where others saw only obstacles. The encounter with the Zorn became a turning point in galactic civilization. It wasn't just a moment in history. It was a fundamental shift in understanding what intelligence could be. And somewhere in the vast emptiness of space, new human ships continued to explore, to create, to challenge every fundamental assumption about existence. The universe would never be the same again. Humanity had arrived, and the galaxy was just beginning to understand what that truly meant.